Hi, Jim.
Morning, Bob.
How you doing?
Great, thanks. You?
Good. Good to have you back for your second appearance on Blogging Heads TV.
Thank you.
I should say, in case anybody's listening on podcast, you are Jim Pinkerton. You worked in the Reagan administration and in the administration of the first President Bush. You write a column for Newsday.
Right. Contributor to Fox News.
What's that?
Contributor to Fox News. Don't forget
I was going to try to skip over that part, Jim, but you win. Well, we accord one plug to each guest. Now, when you were last on and your counterpart was Mickey, it actually generated a lot of email. I don't think we forwarded you the email. But
no, I got some on my own.
Did you?
So,
well,
yes.
There was a lot came into us, high energy email. A lot of it was favorable to you. Some of it was unfavorable, and unfortunately, the one that I'm about to read from falls into the latter category, Jim. It's from Curtis E. Hello, guys. Oh, no, wait. The Curtis E. I'm going to read later. Curtis E. actually has an interesting analytical point about immigration. Kyle D. writes, "What's with Pinkerton? That guy is nuts. Mickey needs to stand up to him or put Robert in the other chair. That stuff on immigration is crazy." So, Jim, okay. Robert is in the other chair, so everything will be under control this time.
They're bringing in the bruiser now. Okay, got it.
Yeah. We are going to talk about immigration.
Okay.
For starters, Bush, not long after we talk, is going to give this televised speech in which he says he's going to deploy the National Guard along the border. Before we talk about that, I have a question for you that really will enlighten me, because I'm not all that much in touch with the political terrain. When people say that immigration is giving Bush trouble with his base, and by that they mean the part of his policy that is generous toward illegal immigrants, who exactly is the base? I mean, for starters, everyone seems to agree that it includes some evangelical Christians. What's your definition of Bush's base?
I would call Bush's base conservative nationalists who put a great premium on the integrity of the American nation. And they are quite mad at Bush. I've written a lot about this topic in the last few weeks, and so I've heard from a lot of them. They believe very strongly that Bush is selling out America to a combination of business interests that want cheap labor and multiculturalists on the left who simply don't believe in the idea of a unitary American nation.
So this is true even of the part of the base that goes beyond the evangelicals?
Oh, I think so. Absolutely. I think there's just a lot of just plain old conservatives who don't like what Bush is doing, and it registers now in the polls very dramatically. And I think that's why Bush is giving a speech which, by the way, I think will be kind of a fraud, in that Bush doesn't really intend to do anything if he doesn't have to. There's an article in the New York Times this morning that says that Bush spoke with President Fox of Mexico and says, "Listen, I'm just doing this,
it's all for show, don't worry.
Boo bait for the bubbas," as Senator Moynihan said a while back. I think that probably speaks to what Bush thinks he has to do right now to get over this trough of public opinion.
Okay, so these people in the base, they don't have the concern that some constituencies of the Democratic Party have, because they actually, by and large, don't compete economically with the immigrants, right? These are not people who do yard work and bus tables and work at fast food places.
Well,
right?
I think a lot of them probably do have blue-collar jobs.
But there's blue-collar and blue-collar. I mean, a lot of blue-collar jobs so far have not gotten much competition from illegal aliens, right?
I'm not exactly sure, but certainly any job in, say, meatpacking was once a solidly working-class job. Back when I was in Chicago 100 years ago, where I'm from, that was a ticket to the middle class, was working in the stockyards. Now those are entirely immigrants. Look, I'm no enemy of economic change, and frankly, the goal for everybody is not to be doing blue-collar work. It's to be, having a more placid job in an office. So in some sense, I personally am for regulated legal immigration on the new blood, new ideas, new energy continuum. However, I think the status quo, both parties have clearly sort of neglected basic maintenance of a sense of national order, and now they're paying a price for it at the polls.
Okay, now let me give you a chance to, I think, clarify something you said that alarmed a number of our viewers. You said that no multicultural society has ever worked. Now, first of all, you did not mean multi-ethnic, right?
Right, I meant multicultural. People speaking different languages, people with different political, cultural traditions, coexisting in a country. That's not a country, actually. That's an empire, and empires don't last. You
meant, in other words, that if you're going to be multi-ethnic, you should follow the assimilationist model.
You have no choice. You won't exist otherwise. I think that's very, very clear as we look around at Yugoslavia and the former Soviet Union and Lebanon and Iraq right now and so on.
You've segued beautifully to Curtis E.'s email. He notes that you, to support this point, mentioned Lebanon, Russia, and the former Yugoslavia. He says, I believe in all these cases, the country's borders were drawn around existing ethnic communities originally, and that the multicultural nature of these places was not created through immigration. So that is, if he's right, that is a difference, right?
That's an interesting point. But however, what doesn't really matter how they're created, it's the fact that they exist. I mean, if Texas and California become Mexican places, they will eventually become like Mexico.
I've lived in El Paso and San Antonio. They've long been largely Mexican places, Jim.
All right.
I mean, going back to my childhood, which is a long time ago, it seemed to be working okay. I mean, they were learning to speak English, and they were, part of the economy, good citizens.
Again, there's nothing wrong with immigration. The question is, if you allow a different political tradition to emerge, then you get a different place. I mean, suburban Paris might as well be Algeria right now for all the harmony and cooperation between the French and the Arabs in France. I mean, the demography changes things radically.
Well, right, but clearly it isn't ethnicity per se if what I'm saying about Texas 30, 40 years ago is right. So it seems to me in principle possible that if we follow the assimilationist model, another wave of immigrants needn't lead to your nightmare, right? And we show signs. We show signs of getting the picture. I mean, for example, bilingual education in California has been reformed, at least to some extent, so it's less likely to leave kids trapped in a one-language ghetto and so on.
I agree. If we had a tough-minded government, and there's no reason why it has to be Republicans, it could be Democrats, that said, listen, obviously, we don't care where you come from, we don't care what you do at home, but in the public square, you have to speak English and have to live by our sort of civic rituals and so on. If I trusted the teachers' unions and the public employees and frankly, Madison Avenue, to strictly enforce a kind of uniculturality, I wouldn't be worried about immigration. I'd be all for it on the new blood, more the merrier principle.
Yeah. I mean, and as for the National Guard, first I should say Curtis has one other interesting point of what may be a truly multicultural society, which has survived at least for a while, which is Belgium. Now, I think both the Catholics and the Protestants speak both French and Flemish, but I think, is it not the case, maybe I'm wrong, the Catholics speak primarily French, and Protestants speak primarily Flemish?
I'm not 100% sure about Belgium, but I do know that Belgium is very riven between the Flemish and I think they're called the Walloons. I wouldn't want to wish that on a country if you didn't have to have it.
Yeah, well, I mean, tensions wax and wane. It survived for a while. As for the National Guard itself, I would say my own take is this, that actually, in principle, I am for tightened border security per se, which is, say, security at the border, for the following reason, which is that, first of all, I do not want to start hounding illegal immigrants already in America, because it seems to me they came over when the understanding was, yeah, you do have to evade the Border Patrol, but ultimately the unspoken understanding is they welcome us, we work, it's all fine. And it seems to me if you start really hounding them, you're changing the rules. Employer sanctions have the effect of kind of hounding them, and that's changing the rules. I would personally like to take the immigrants that are already here and, however slowly and arduously, give them the eventual opportunity of citizenship, and I'd be perfectly willing to set up the kinds of barriers you want, which is to say ensure that they're truly fluent in English and they understand the American system and so on. But if you're going to do that, if you're going to liberalize with amnesty or whatever, you do, if you're not going to worry about the incentive effects, drawing more and more waves over, you do have to tighten up the actual border per se. I think that's doable. I personally don't like the symbolism of military-looking people doing the enforcing. So if they're going to make this a long-term thing, which I guess they're claiming they're not, but if they are, I would like to see them take whatever National Guards are using, give them a new name, a new designation, new blue uniforms, carry pistols instead of rifles, just for the symbolism. I mean, we Americans don't understand how we're perceived. In Mexico, when you start amassing things that look like troops on the border, you know, they start thinking, hey, these Americans will do anything. They invaded Iraq. So that would be my take. And you, I think, you'd be all for border security per se, right?
Yeah,
you
Bob,
just think that this won't have teeth.
Sounds to me like you've kind of let Curtis E. down. I thought you were here to clobber me. I kind of agree with you. I think, and by the way, I think that Bush doesn't mean it on border security. I think Bush is in the pocket of, you know, his own, of Karl Rove, who has this vision of Hispanics all becoming Republicans. But I think the next president, whoever he or she is, and whatever party he or she belongs to, is going to wind up increasing and ratcheting up border security even more. I think the majority of the country has spoken pretty loudly on this issue, and so I think Bush is kind of a lagging indicator. So I think the future, I'm actually kind of optimistic about this issue, and I'm happy to sit still for discussions about rifles, pistols as opposed to rifles, and sort of a you know, powder blue uniforms as opposed to ninja black. Those all make sense to me because we do have obviously a destiny with Mexico, and we ought to get along with them as best we can.
Yeah, and like you, I'm for controlled immigration. So I mean, Mickey and I actually, this is the Hegelian dialectic at work. I mean, Mickey and I both moved on this issue through talking to each other. He is now against, I think, employer sanctions, and he is now willing to confine it to border security per se. The difference remains that I say go ahead and move toward the more generous policy as you're doing that. He wants to just do border security, wait and see, and I'd rather be symmetrical from the beginning. But anyway, we've achieved mutual understanding or something. And maybe our viewers are less alarmed by your presence now, or more alarmed by mine. I don't know. Do you have anything else to say about immigration?
No, let's ring the bell. Right.
Okay, we have no bell, but I'll just say ding, and let's move to Somalia, which we last heard a lot about during the Clinton administration. It showed up in the newspapers again this past week. Violence has broken out. There hadn't, I gather, really been successful governance there since the Clinton episode. And now those of us who haven't been paying much attention learn that there is fighting between something called the Union of Islamic Courts, and they are, I gather, radically Islamic. That's the way they're mainly being depicted, and they are trying to establish order through a series of Islamic courts. They are against the warlords who are now fighting, and more than 100 people died in the last week in either Mogadishu or Somalia writ larger. What's your take on this?
Well, I mean, I think that George Bush, circa 2000, put it pretty well. Nation building in places that we don't have vital national interests, where we don't understand the language and the culture, is extremely difficult, if not impossible. Bush was correct in his critique of Somalia, and of course incorrect when he tried to reverse himself and go to Iraq and do the exact same thing. I think that for better or worse, and I've never been to Somalia and know nothing about the country, the chances that the United States can play a very constructive role in stopping this carnage is very small. I think that we have an interest, humanitarian and national, in helping figure out some kind of solution there, which I would imagine would involve some kind of peacekeeping group of people from the area. That's the mistake I think the UN keeps making. You don't want to bring in Canadians and Norwegians. You want to bring in Kenyans and Tanzanians or whatever, if they're willing to go.
Although the African Union has turned out not to be quite up to the task in Sudan.
Well, okay. I mean, that point is, as the Duke of Wellington said, for a great power, there are no small wars. I mean, if the great powers get involved in Somalia, as happened in 92, 93, and 94 under Bush and Clinton, you get backfires and backlashes that you can't even imagine. I mean, we didn't know on Black Hawk Down Day that Bin Laden and all those people were watching and observing all this. I mean, we were worse off for having gone in. I think in many places around the world there are civil wars that are sort of yearning to be free. They're yearning to be fought. And the idea that, the Green Berets or the German or Dutch army is going to come in there and make them stop wanting to kill each other, I think is pretty small.
Well, do you not worry that if the Union of Islamic Courts succeeds, that will become a haven for Islamic radicals, including terrorists? That is apparently the concern of the Bush administration, and in fact, apparently, we are involved. I mean, there's a lot of reporting that we are backing the warlords in this fight, which is something I didn't realize.
I think it's okay to, look, if we think there's good guys and bad guys in Somalia, or in Sudan, or in Sierra Leone, or Liberia, or other places in Africa that have active civil wars, I think we should help the side we like. I think that's perfectly legitimate as a matter of strategy. If we think, we give them weapons and we hope they win because these wars get solved when somebody wins and somebody loses. They don't get solved when you get people who hate each other and say, okay, now look, we're just going to put a line between the middle of you and a bunch of sunburned Americans are going to stand in between and try and keep the peace. Okay. If we want the warlords to win, help the warlords win.
Okay, but two questions I have. And the first one is whether you share a premise of mine, which is that these things are delicate because if we are backing warlords who are fighting an Islamist organization, we run the risk of playing into the hands of terrorist recruiters by being depicted as, suppressing the true expression of Islam. I mean, for example, if we kill a lot of our people who are clearly ours, and we're giving them the weapons, and they're killing a lot of civilians, and I'll bet these guys aren't too delicate about who they kill and who they don't kill. You agree that is at least to some extent a downside, maybe in your view a regrettable but necessary one, but that goes into the negative part of the calculus, right?
Oh, absolutely. That's why I oppose sending U.S. troops to Sudan, because in the Sudan, Al-Qaeda and other Arab countries are saying, here's yet another plot by the West to stick it to Muslims. And again, I'm no expert on this. I just know what Al-Qaeda types and Zawahiri and whoever are saying about this. My thought is, and maybe I'm being too cute, as it were, is that by sending weapons as opposed to sending troops, we're a little more subtle about what we want to get done. But if we fear an Islamic takeover in Somalia, and again, it's not 100% clear to me that Islamic Somalis are the same as Arab Somalis or Iranian Somalis, but if we fear that, and we have a discussion about it, then we decide we don't want it to happen, then I think we should take steps to not make it happen, although, as I said, quoting the Duke of Wellington again, if it's American troops going in there, then you just know that there'll be 500 TV cameras watching, and that's probably more bad PR in the Muslim world than we want.
Right. Although you would agree that there's at least some possibility of some PR blowback. If it's just widely known that we're backing these guys, we're giving them weapons. We can still sustain a little damage. And I guess my point is, if we agree that those two variables at play, and that doing this thing right in Somalia involves figuring out, is there a connection with Al-Qaeda, with these guys? How radical are they? How bad is the PR blowback? I do not trust the Bush administration to make this judgment, and I suspect that you do not.
I think that the Bush administration has kind of shot its wad credibility-wise, and even if they could make a good case that there's a danger of Al-Qaeda penetration in Somalia, and obviously, if it's the Bush CIA saying it, nobody's going to believe them.
Okay, and here's my only actual comment on this situation. A quote from the New York Times says that Washington, quote, is widely believed to be financing the warlords. Well, as an American taxpayer, I would like to know. I would like us to discuss this, because like you, I don't think the Bush administration is competent to make these kinds of decisions, right? This should be a matter of public debate. It's kind of a double-edged sword, because if we acknowledge it and make it public, maybe that increases the blowback from our involvement. But I just do not trust the administration, and I think we should argue about this.
But Bob, did you just come on to the show with me to agree with me and everything?
So far, I'm 2 for 2, right?
Yeah, 2 for 2.
Although it's not entirely clear who is succumbing to whose powerful logic. But, the main thing is that we're forming a new political party at the end, right? Okay, good. So we agree. We agree. But we haven't gotten to the climactic discussion of outer space, which looms at the end. And in fact, I'm going to use that to segue to our next topic, which is Israel. I'm going to use outer space to segue to Israel and the whole Hamas problem. And here is, and I would say this is the only part of your dialogue with Mickey where I was briefly tempted to sign on to this viewer's judgment that you may be flirting with insanity, okay? At the end, of course, this is, you have this idea, and we'll discuss this at the end, that humankind's destiny is ultimately to populate outer space and spread across the entire universe. Moreover, you think it's a damn good thing because this particular planet is headed down the toilet bowl, more or less ineluctably in your view, I think, or at least things are, a lot of trend lines are looking bad. And here's the quote from you in the last dialogue. It's a shame that so few people share that vision of optimism about the human prospect across the universe, and they let themselves instead get tangled up in whether we can make peace between the Israelis and the Palestinians. Now, I hope you don't think no one should spend any time trying to think about how to get a good outcome between Israel and the Palestinians, right?
Oh, I'm all for it.
Okay. Good. Now we can proceed to discuss Israel. Now, I perhaps naively, when Hamas won this election, I thought it was actually maybe an opportunity because I thought that could exert a moderating influence on Hamas. The burdens of actual political leadership, involvement with, elites from other nations whose respect you want, and to get it, you're going to have to change your tune a little, and so on. And I thought it was a mistake that we and Europe just kind of immediately cut off aid on which they are highly dependent, and said, we're going to leave the spigot off until you recognize Israel. What I said to Mickey at the time is, look, if we say this, if we do this ultimatum publicly, it makes it harder for them to save face, and everyone wants to save face. What we should do is say to them under the table in a private room, you've got 6 months to change your tune, and then we're going to turn the spigot off. I said, I just think, it's going to be easier. Well, what's happened has been kind of predictable, I think. We shut off the money, the Europeans shut off the money, and now we don't quite have a humanitarian crisis in the occupied territory, but we're close to the point where we're going to have footage of dialysis patients who don't have dialysis machines. I mean, the hospitals apparently really are facing acute shortages and so on. So now there are these movements afoot to somehow channel money to the people who need it without it going through Hamas. America is managing to let itself be depicted as only reluctantly going along with this at the behest of the Europeans, and thus sustaining more public relations damage. But anyway, what's your take on the whole situation?
Well, I would add, just reading the paper that, and again, it's all funny money in terms of who knows how much is actually getting delivered and who's going where. But I've read that the Russians, the Saudis, the Iranians are all chipping in money to help the Palestinians just as they are, and of course, so now as you said, under some different pocket, we're giving money to them as well. Look, but just to step back from the immediate toing and froing of Hamas versus the Israeli government and so on, I'll just make a larger point, and that is, if your goal is to control a piece of territory, in this case the West Bank, then you have two solutions. You can either kill all the locals or drive them out and make the existing population disappear so that you can move in, or you can find a way to make friends with the local population. What you can't do is torment them and occupy them and treat them like this. In other words, that doesn't work. The results of that experiment since 1967 are right in front of us. What does work is ethnic cleansing. When the United States decided we wanted to own, the English wanted to own North America, we killed all the Indians. That worked. And drove the few survivors into itty-bitty reservations in South Dakota and Oklahoma. That works pretty well. But if this country, if the United States were 40% Native American, we'd have exact same trouble the Israelis are having with the Palestinians.
Well, actually, by now there might have been assimilation. I speak as someone who has a little Native American blood in me, by the way. So careful, buddy. And we should hasten to clarify that you are not saying that ethnic cleansing would have been the right policy in Israel.
No, I'm saying, listen, the fact that you have Native American blood only proves that, again, as I said in the intro, you can either make them like you somehow. In other words, the fact that you have Indians and Anglos, as it were, in your background only proves it can work. But it has to work on that basis of mixing ethnicity and mixing blood. You can't do it on a two-tier system because eventually you get a rebellion.
Yeah, I would say what you're saying is in a way truer than ever. I think subjugating people is harder than ever because of various technologies, including, first of all, information technologies that allow people to organize rebellions very easily, email and so on. And the other are these munitions technologies that are going to become increasingly accessible. You already see this with the bombs that are being used, but I think the great threat for Israel is that eventually these guys get a hold of a nuke and do Tel Aviv. And so, I basically agree. I would further say that the other two options you outlined, genocide and ethnic cleansing, in addition to having moral downsides, are themselves not viable in the modern world. You know, it's not like Israel could get away with that and remain an upstanding member of the international community. So, look, I think we probably agree on this that the Israel's policy has not been far-sighted. I think in a way the biggest mistake that Israel made, going back decades, and America is complicit for not restraining this impulse, because the impulse is in a way understandable. If you're living in Israel, you feel very vulnerable, especially in, only a couple of decades after World War II. But the mistake was that they thought that all their major security threats were going to come from attacks by nation states, and for that reason they established the settlements. But it turns out that no, they have a major security problem from the occupied population, and the settlements have vastly complicated the prospects for solving that problem.
As Robert Heinlein said, years ago, the science fiction writer, an armed society is a polite society. And with the Israelis moving to the West Bank, they didn't take the Arabs either as nation states or as individuals seriously. And if the Arabs and the Iranians or the Pakistanis or somebody wind up with a bunch of A-bombs, then the necessity of being polite in all possible ways goes up about 1,000,000%. And at that point, the Israelis, I think, would say to themselves, look, the value of some settlement in the West Bank is a lot less than the downside of getting nuked. And so I think that this, all of a sudden, a new wave of politeness will descend on the Middle East. It hasn't been seen so far.
Well, I hope we see some politeness. I think Americans don't realize, though, how problematic the territorial issues are. Ariel Sharon gets applauded because he was planning to withdraw from a significant number of settlements and so on, but still, it was what they're falling back, what Israel's falling back to, which is basically more or less where they're building the wall, is really nothing like the 1967 borders in terms of, in a qualitative sense. In a quantitative sense, of course, you can give them as much land as they had, but in a qualitative sense, a lot of Americans don't realize that before 1967, Israel did not have East Jerusalem. They did not have the old city of Jerusalem. Isn't that right? And from the Palestinian point of view, that turf really matters, and it does not belong to Israel under present international law. And virtually nobody in Israel is talking about a retreat to true 1967 borders, and I don't see much less than that bringing Hamas around personally. So I'm kind of depressed.
Well, I think also, the wall on the western side of Israel looks a lot, or at least somewhat similar to the 67 lines. But you don't really seem to notice, or not you, but I mean, what the world isn't noticing is that, as I understand it, on the Olmert plan, they want to keep the Jordan Valley, which is to say that the Palestinian areas would be a little, 2 or 3 little islands, little circles of territory completely surrounded by Israeli-controlled territory. I mean, that's just, that. If you go back and look at the map of South Africa when they had these little pseudo homelands like Ciskei and Transkei and so on, that didn't work very well as a model. Forget whoever's right and whoever's wrong on the issues. The fact is, if you have a huge hostile population inside your country, you're going to have trouble, whether it's in North America or Asia or the Middle East.
Yeah. On the positive side, I would say apparently there was some petition or something signed by prominent Palestinians who are in jail in Israel, and included a lot of members of Hamas as well as Fatah, which did embrace a two-state solution. So there are at least some high-profile Hamas people who have gotten explicit about a two-state solution. Now, as is typical in the article reporting this, you see a sentence like this: but the political leader of Hamas is considered to be Khaled Mashal, based in Damascus, and then it goes on to note that he's persisting in his hard line. Well, yeah, but if there was one trivially easy opportunity that was presented by Hamas winning this election, it was to make him no longer the number one guy, because that's not where the action was going to be if you would actually let Hamas govern. I mean, in my view, it would not have been hard to in effect create a cleavage between this guy who's off in Syria with zero actual power and these guys who actually get to run some territory. But anyway, I think it's hopeful that this petition was signed at all. You know, what's weird is that there's apparently another thing you and I agree on. I mean, there's just something wrong with the logic here.
No, I think the only thing I would say is I don't really happen to believe the Palestinians are interested in a two-state solution. I think they want a one-state solution.
Well, then you are even more pessimistic than I mean. My view, I am sufficiently cynical to think that whatever people's convictions are now, you can change their goals by changing what it takes for them to maintain social status and security in their community. I think people's belief systems are actually quite malleable if you're sufficiently cynical in the way you try to manipulate them, because people above all want to be respected by certain other people.
I think actually, Bob, your secular humanist roots are showing here a little bit too much, I think, in terms of your analysis. I think you're neglecting the role of Islam. I think you're rejecting the role of messianic apocalyptic religions, which don't really lend themselves to this kind of granulated, nuanced parsing. I think that there's a massive religious wave going through the Middle East and through the Muslim world, and for that matter, much of the Christian world too, that isn't interested in these kinds of gradations and compromises.
There is a wave, and there have been waves before, and they come and they recede. And a sign of how malleable people's belief systems are is, as you know, 30 or 40 years ago, religion did not play a very big role in the thought of Palestinians. It was a largely, in effect, a fairly secular Muslim population.
And very Christian, too, by the way. Of course, Christians are all pretty much
gone. And so clearly, a set of circumstances and developments changed the frame of mind and increased the appeal of religious fanaticism. And I maintain that by changing the circumstances, you can decrease the appeal of religious fanaticism. It takes a while. It has to be done delicately, and that's why I'm so depressed that the people in charge of the world are who they are.
But I would just add, I mean, if you want to be depressed, I wrote this piece, actually, curiously enough, for the Jerusalem Post in January of 2003. It's online, in which I compared the situation in the Middle East to what Isaiah Berlin, the famous historian and essayist, called the German counter-enlightenment, in which he made the point that the French had gone into Germany and to liberate and to modernize and so on, and the Germans for a little while liked it, and then the deep irrationalism of German nationalism, as Berlin called it, the counter-enlightenment, came in, and that lasted, from the first decade of the 19th century through 1945. So once you set a wave like that in motion, it may not be a decade or two, it may be a century or two. And now, as we discussed earlier, and I'm sure we'll discuss again, this is all, to quote Winston Churchill, made all the worse by the perverted lights of perverted technology. That quote from Churchill in 1940, with A-bombs and WMDs. Nutty nationalists and messianic religious people can do a lot more damage than they could have even a decade or two ago.
No, I think that's true. But it leads me to ask you, why are you not? It seems you should be even more depressed than you sound. In other words, you're saying, look, the Israeli strategy is not viable. But I think you're saying that. But if indeed the Palestinians are truly, inexorably, unchangeably bent, and I disagree with you here, but you're saying they are unchangeably bent on the destruction of Israel, then what choice does Israel have? Seems to me they are doing the right thing. I mean, accommodation holds no hope in your worldview.
Well, anything's possible. My own guess is that they're eventually going to have to achieve a total separation ethnically on the territory, and that they won't be able to have 2 or 3 million Palestinians sitting inside the West Bank. This fellow Avigdor Lieberman is a big politician in Israel, and seen as kind of a nut. But if they aren't willing to entertain notions like transfer, however horrible that is, and I understand it's a massive PR hit, I just can't imagine Israel being a viable country with.
Wait, transfer from where to where? You mean from the Arabs
from the West Bank, from the West Bank to somewhere else?
Well, you also have a lot of Arabs inside Israel proper.
Well, I suspect I've never met Lieberman. I suspect he has a plan for them too.
Yeah, actually, an Israeli court ruled just this week that those Arabs cannot marry, or if they marry Palestinian Arabs, the Palestinian Arabs cannot come live within Israel proper. But I'm sorry, but I think the situation is not beyond salvaging because, for one thing, if you look at the public opinion polls, they're still, it's getting worse every day because of the way Israel and the United States are misplaying this whole thing, but there's still considerable numbers of Palestinians who say they want a two-state solution, and, the minds are in play. I got an email from a guy who was in Thailand dealing with young Muslims, and he said, look, you can just see their minds on this fence are going to go one way or the other because both kinds of people are trying to influence them. Moderates are trying to influence them and radicals are trying to influence them. And what he said was the news about America's involvement in Iraq gives a leg up to the radicals. And you can see the way changing circumstances makes it harder or easier for people to take the moderate path. I don't think the situation's out of control, beyond salvaging in Israel and Palestine. But I've got to say, if you don't have a change in leadership in Israel and the United States, I agree, it's completely hopeless, and Tel Aviv will probably get nuked within a couple of decades. So we're at least equally depressed. We don't agree entirely, but we're about equally you're more depressed than I am, which is good.
I think it's just more of a historically based sense of what works and doesn't work, and it goes back to immigration in the United States. You can't have hostile populations without that hostility expressing itself. And if more lethal technology is available, it'll get used.
Well, that's not always the case. A lot of people were saying in the late 40s, look, we'll definitely have a nuclear exchange soon. It hasn't happened. So I don't know. All I would say is that I bring a message of hope and you bring a message of despair, and we'll let viewers send an email and join my cause and condemn you. Is that okay?
Okay, that's fine.
Okay. I encourage that, by the way. And they don't even have to send an email. They just want to walk around on the streets condemning you. That's okay. And hailing me. But still, our analysis mostly overlaps, actually.
I'm sorry?
I said still, our analysis mostly overlaps. Our analysis mostly coincides on that point, on that issue.
So they should pick at you too, then.
What?
They should pick at you as well.
I didn't hear that.
They should pick at you as well.
I encourage. Look, all publicity is good publicity. Just spell my name right, and in my case, that shouldn't be hard. Okay, so we're going to talk about China. And here, I mean, there is this a difference between us maybe emerging, which is that you are a little more prone to pessimistic scenarios than I am. And look, I'm no wild-eyed optimist, I think, but maybe this will surface more in the case of China. I have two premises guiding my view of China, and I want to get clear on where you disagree. Okay. One of them, and by the way, you and Mickey kind of, I mean, again, all publicity is good publicity, but I think you guys kind of mischaracterized one of my views. It isn't my argument that democracy inexorably leads to peace. I do think that economic engagement and development, and then they're related, intricate, organic economic engagement reduce the chances of nations going to war. Now, do you take issue with that?
I agree that it reduces the chances that it goes to war. I agree it reduces them. However, it doesn't eliminate it. And other factors like national rivalry, like ethnic jockeying, like political ambition, can increase the chances of going to war.
Okay. And you think, I think, in China... Well, before we get on to whether that makes some kind of war with China inevitable, my second premise is that economic liberty, that is to say market economics, especially in the modern technological environment, tends to encourage political pluralism. And my view is you're seeing that in China. In fact, I want to quote from this blog, Democracy Arsenal, a very good blog. This is a post by Suzanne Nossel. She just went to China. She says the people may be barred from certain Google searches, but China's fast-growing middle class can see and write and talk right over the fences the government has built for them. That's my sense, too. And so my sense is, look, if the government continues to pursue a path of prosperity, they're going to have more and more trouble sustaining one-party rule. And in fact, you're already seeing a lot of protests in the rural areas especially, and you're seeing the government respond to some of the grievances expressed. But anyway, on the general principle that economic liberty encourages political liberty, I would think on the principle, you as an old-time libertarian might sign on to that in the abstract.
I would. But let's get back to the point here. If China becomes, and I tend to agree that it's becoming more pluralist and even a little bit more democratic and responsive to public opinion and strikes and riots and so on and so on, if all those things are true, does that mean that a more democratic and pluralist China would regard Taiwan as an issue any differently? Would it regard South Korea any differently? Would it regard, most of all, Japan any differently? And I think the answer is no. I think that in all three cases, a democratic China would have virtually the same foreign policy toward Taiwan, South Korea, and Japan as the current Chinese government does.
So do I. Because, again, I don't put the emphasis on democracy in terms of peace among nations so much as on economic engagement. And I think you're already seeing enough economic interdependence that China's not making a lot of waves in the region right now.
Well, except I think that Japan and China are headed toward a conflict.
Well, that is definitely the one case.
Japan is a perfectly democratic country. The point is the Japanese are unapologetic nationalists. They really aren't sorry for what they did in World War II. I think they feel that the Chinese are threatening them, and I think it's only a matter of time before Japan completely rearms. And then if you've got two countries with hair-trigger militaries sitting there 100 miles across the ocean from each other, you're going to get a conflict, period.
No, I agree. That is the darkest spot on the horizon now. Their relations are not good, and it points to something you may be saying, and something I don't really disagree with, which is that in some ways democracy actually complicates an enlightened foreign policy. Because one thing Japan has done, their leaders have a tendency to, in order to win votes, to visit this war shrine in Japan, which apparently just drives the Chinese nuts every time a Japanese leader visits it. And they keep doing it. And so I don't deny that democracy in some ways even complicates the thing. But I do think the larger realm of freedom of movement and economic engagement, the more you get, and you don't maybe have much or nearly enough of this yet, but the more you get Japanese business people and Chinese business people going to each other's countries, doing deals, knowing each other, I think, I'm enough of a Marxist in terms of where I think influence lies within a society, that is to say it lies with elites largely, to think that once you have a lot of elites who have an interest in engagement and are profiting from it and know each other across national lines, I think that's the kind of thing that can help a lot.
You're not a Marxist, Bob. You're an angelite, as in Norman Angel, the famous author who...
don't bring him up.
No,
Seriously.
bring him up. Who wrote a book in 1910 called The Great Illusion, in which he said that Germany and France, the largest trading partners with each other, would be crazy to fight a war with each other. He was right. They were crazy to fight a war with each other. It was a lose-lose for both of them. But they did it anyway, and relatively happily so. Well, I mean, the point is, all this economic determinist argument you're trying to make flunks the test of politicians and their pride and egos and megalomania and all the other unpleasant characteristics that typify the political class, including the kind of people who get elected to run democracies as well as dictatorships. Those factors are much more dispositive in why countries go to war than the fact that the Business Roundtable and the Chinese equivalent of the Business Roundtable are meeting for golf at Pebble Beach.
Don't distract me with golf, Jim. It tempts me to actually go out and humiliate myself on the golf course. Let me say two things in response to that. Norman Angel, I'm told this book is sometimes mischaracterized. I'm not saying you didn't actually just mischaracterize it, but some people say he confidently predicted there would be no war. I think what he actually did is what you said, which is point out that it would be illogical and maybe express some hope for that reason that it wouldn't happen. But the other thing I'd say about that is maybe he was just underestimating the threshold that's required. I mean, would you say now, I mean, you would agree that now there is a more intricate kind of economic engagement between France and Germany, more in the way of what I'm talking about, that is travel among elites, you know, there's this business class where they talk to each other, and I think you'd agree, now there really is no chance, no meaningful chance of France and Germany fighting each other, and that's an historic fact. Because
there's no meaningful chance unless and until the population of France becomes mostly Arabs and the population of Germany becomes mostly Turks. And if you were to take the kind of Phil Longman trends out 100 or 200 years and you get a completely different population, then I would say all bets are off. But certainly under the current system of the European Union with the United States and NATO sort of sitting on both of them, I completely agree there's zero chance. However, I would say that's kind of a unique situation where the great powers of the world, the great power of the world, has invested so much in preventing a conflict there. I'd say that the more typical situation is an unregulated, if you will, border environment, and that comes back to China, Japan, or India and Pakistan, or 100 different situations in Africa.
Yeah, but I would say China and Japan is a transitional period, much like Germany and France, or in some ways like Germany and France after World War II, at least like it in the sense that it is transitional. I mean, China's emerging from the Cold War. They were enemies during the Cold War. You can't expect everything to fall into place right away. I would say, by and large, the trend lines look good. And I would, there's one other data point I would bring up, which is that I do think there's something different about the modern world compared to all previous times in history, including as recently as World War II. But if you look at the last 50, 60 years, something that used to always be true, I mean, you have this sense that you see among a number of so-called realists in the foreign policy school sense that war among the world's wealthiest and most powerful and biggest nations is ultimately almost inevitable. Maybe you wouldn't put it quite that strongly, but that's a view. Well, for the last 50 years, actually, one thing you have not seen is wars between the world's largest, most economically developed countries. In World War II, you saw it. In World War I, you saw it. Even in the wars involving, Japan, Russia, China, before World War I, you saw in that region the most powerful, most developed countries going at it. These days, what you see when an economically powerful nation launches a war, it's never against another one. And it's very often an attempt to intervene in a conflict involving poorer, less developed nations to stop the conflict.
Well, you could be right. And certainly, I mean, there's two answers to that. One, we could just have been lucky. We could have been on a streak where the United States was able to intervene in Korea and Vietnam and Somalia and Iraq, and one way or another over those 5 or 6 decades, not get themselves into a major world war. I mean, we were actually fighting the Chinese, the People's Republic of China in Korea. There were almost 1 million PRC soldiers killed in Korea, as well as 50,000 or so Americans. So I kind of suspect that there's more hard feelings in China about that than we might be reading about in the Washington Post or Rolling Stone magazine. But I think that the larger question is this phenomenon of just because it hasn't happened lately, will it not happen at all? David Hume dealt with this when he talked about if you see 38 white swans in a row, does that mean the 39th one has to be white? The answer is no, it could be black. It's possible. My own way of thinking about this is that if you have an escalating amount of weapons spending, military spending, and an escalating amount of countries developing, getting nuclear weapons. And I just noticed in the paper over the weekend that President Ahmadinejad of Iran, the dreaded guy, went to Indonesia for an Islamic national or multinational conference, and the Indonesians said, well, we would like to have a nuclear power plant by 2015 in Indonesia. Now, all of a sudden, the whole new realm of potential conflicts between Indonesia and their neighbors, including Australia and whoever else, opens up. I suspect that the Indonesians are thinking to themselves, they're a big country, they're 200 million people. Why shouldn't they have nuclear weapons? Why shouldn't they have a way to stand up to the Chinese and the Americans and whoever else might be intimidating? And why shouldn't they get an Islamic bomb? It worked for Pakistan. Pakistan is a major player precisely because they have an A-bomb. And so with all those nuclear sabers rattling around, I suspect that they're going to start clanging against each other in my lifetime.
Yeah, well, it's a huge problem. I have my ideas about nuclear proliferation and what we should do. It's definitely not what this administration is doing, but time does not permit us to get into that. I guess all I'd say is, you're right, there's no guarantee that the next swan won't be black. I don't have a view of kind of, teleological determinism, but I do believe the currents of history are enough on our side that if we play our cards right, there can be a very high probability that the next few swans will be white. But I'm not taking anything for granted. And although actually I think this administration has done okay with China, in other areas I think they've so misplayed their hand that it may take a while to recover. But this leads us naturally to the entire breadth of the universe, Jim. And outer space, and the aforementioned idea of yours, which I don't intrinsically have a problem with, actually, that the destiny of humanity is to populate other planets, to spread across the whole breadth of the universe. In fact, do you want me to do you one better? Do you want me to get more visionary than you?
Sure.
Okay, here goes. Ultimately, we will face the heat death of the universe. Now, you probably, your time horizons are so short that I'll bet you haven't given this much thought. But there is there's a book, the closest I know of to a book that gets into this kind of cosmic terrain is a book called, I think, Biocosm by James Gardner. It is possible, there's more and more thought given by astrophysicists to the possibility that universes in some sense replicate, and maybe they replicate through black holes or something. One possibility is that the way they replicate is that in those universes in which life survives long enough to spread across the breadth of the universe and get to the point where they have to start worrying about the heat death of the universe, they have to actually design a new universe and set it in motion. And it's possible that it could be that our universe started that way if the following is true, that the constraints on, the physical constraints on actually starting a new universe, after all it's a big job, are such that you can't just put yourself in it. Rather, all you can kind of fit into it is an algorithm that will ultimately lead to organic evolution and life. So it's kind of like reproducing. You're reproducing the whole project. So, I mean, I rest my case. Do you see any problems there?
It's possible. I admit that I think the heat death of the universe is like 5 billion years away, and I haven't thought that far ahead. I haven't made that many, moves on the chessboard forward. I would just settle for the smaller point that again, to quote Robert Heinlein, you can't put all your eggs in one basket. And right now, humanity is putting all its eggs in. We are gambling that we can keep this Earth alive in spite of our own best efforts on nuclear war, on global warming, in spite of whatever comet or meteor might come along. I mean, now they're saying, scientists are, that there's been 5 or 6 big dinosaur-level kill-offs of the entire, or most of the world's population of flora and fauna over the last, billion years. So it happens every so often. So if on an average, maybe once every 100 million years. So I'm more worried about the 100 million year time spread, Bob, than the 5 billion year time spread. But I do worry about both, and I just think that if
Jim, that's the trouble with your generation. I mean, everything is immediate gratification with you guys, Now, I want to feel better,
Right, and so to even show how utterly temporal I am, I would say that in the next century, we're going to face a serious situation where either we climb up what, what I've called in various writings the Pyre curve, which a term I stole from Alfred Bester's.
How do you spell that?
Pyre, but it's capital P, small y, small r, capital E. It's Alfred Bester, the science fiction writer, wrote a book about 1956 called The Stars, My Destination, in which he sort of had this sort of metaphysical substance called Pyre that could blow up the universe, and it's kind of an antimatter thing, and it just always sort of stuck with me. Well, of course, on the evolution of destruction from the fist and the arrowhead to the machine gun and the bazooka to the airplane to the A-bomb to the whatever else comes up after that, of course, it's rapidly rising, powered on by all the things like Moore's Law and better technology and so on. I was just reading an article last night in Popular Science about some professor at Stanford who has developed a machine for creating more inventions. It's a bunch of computers. His name is Koza, K-O-Z-A. And this is now, we're hitting the point where it's, what John von Neumann talked about half a century ago in terms of self-replicating robots, self-replicating machines. If we've completely taken the invention of inventions out of the human prospect, out of any ethical or moral system of restraint, not that that's always worked, that people have invented, then we really have gotten to what Harlan Ellison talked about in his famous short story, I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream, about what happens when the computers decide to say what they really think about us as human beings and how much they, well, to put it mildly, dislike us. People should read the story. It's online.
Well, yeah, we're heading into the Matrix territory.
Well, but you're right. But the thing is, if we can't think about those things, if we can't wrestle with a century ahead, I mean, the people who built cathedrals were thinking 2 centuries ahead. The people who built pyramids are thinking a century or 2 ahead. It is a strange coming to pass that now, here, when we have all this education and knowledge and enlightenment, allegedly, we can't plan according to the time horizons that have been routine in past civilizations. I mean, that's really pathetic.
Yeah, I don't totally disagree by any means. And I'm not kidding about the Matrix scenario. Sometime we should have that discussion about whether there is a significant prospect of you and I winding up in pods built by computers having dreams while they use our bodies as batteries or whatever. We don't have time for that today, but I would say, I mean, it may be the case that ultimately, for the human experiment to survive, we do have to populate other planets. I am for an active space program. All I would say is that even if you have a fairly active space program, it will be some time before we have the technology to create truly self-sustaining, civilizations on planets. It will also be some time before we can get many Earthlings to them. And until that point, you're not going to get much political support, for the idea of putting all our eggs in that basket. I mean, for all these reasons, I would say to make that scenario work, I think we've got to keep this planet humming for another century or so, even if we're actively exploring it.
But I agree with you. It would take at least a century.
I just want to stress that this is not cause to give up on. I mean, I basically, in some proportion, agree with you and agree that we should have an active space program, and yet I come away from that feeling just as much compulsion to engage in the problems that are facing us on the Earth as I did, because my time horizons were never much more than a century anyway, to be honest,
Well, I think, look at it would take trillions of dollars. We're going to have, obviously, massive economic growth here and around the world, and I hope other countries compete. I hope, frankly, I think the only way I can foresee a space program that actually moved people onto the moon or Mars or wherever is in the form of competition. So I hope that the Chinese and the Israelis and the Indians and whoever else all get the same bug, so that they do it, and we'll figure out who can get there cheapest and fastest, bestest. But because I think the point I would make is that the most profound geopolitical shift of the second millennium was a discovery and conquest of America, especially North America, by the English. That changed everything. It changed everything about Europe and changed everything about Asia. And so the prize, if you will, of gaining a new territory and all the resources and assets and so on that can come out of that was reaped in the second half of the second millennium, certainly, by the Anglo-Saxons substantially, and to their great benefit, as World War I and World War II demonstrated. So I think the same process will ultimately be seen as having played out outside of the Earth and elsewhere in the solar system. And so the big winner of the third millennium, whatever country that is going to be the country, I think, that jumps on this opportunity.
Okay, well, I would love to reply, but we're over an hour, which I think means we truly have gone where no blogging head has gone before, Jim. And we'll see whether any viewers go this far.
Okay.
But we're unafraid to forge new frontiers on this show, and we've just done it. Well, as usual, I mean, when you're on the show, there is this sense that, we've got to have this guy on again, whether he's crazy or not.
Well,
and possibly all the more so if he's crazy, because it's all about ratings, man. And so thanks a lot.
Thank you, Bob. Thanks for having me.
Okay, we'll see you soon.
Okay,
bye-bye.